right now, I mean, literally right this second, your wrist is probably generating a data trail so uniquely yours that that an artificial intelligence could potentially pick you out of a police lineup just by analyzing the mathematical rhythm of your heartbeat.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, most of us treat our smartwatches like, well, like glorified pedometers, right?
Yeah.
They tell time, they buzz when we get a text. But tech companies and medical researchers, they're treating them like a 24/7 clinical surveillance grid.
Which is exactly why today's deep dive is taking a highly analytical angle. We are acting as medical researchers today. We've got a towering stack of literature in front of us, including these comprehensive systematic reviews. There's one that aggregated data across 61 different articles on chronic disease monitoring.
Oh, and the
We're-
cardiovascular one.
Yeah, right, yeah. A massive review of 38 articles specifically targeting cardiovascular health. And we are pairing all of those broad overviews with a highly specific, honestly very revealing clinical pilot study, one that actually tested Apple Watches on patients actively undergoing surgery in an operating room.
Because our core mission here is to critically evaluate the evidence base. When we look at these devices through a clinical lens, we really have to strip away the slick marketing campaigns. We are looking for the methodological strengths and, frankly, the glaring limitations.
Right.
All to answer one fundamental question. Are wearables driving a legitimate medical revolution? Or are they just a technological placebo?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we're going to judge the medical merits of these things, we have to start at the physical point of contact. What is actually happening under the chassis of the watch? Because, they aren't just taking your pulse with a tiny mechanical finger.
No, not quite. So let's open up the engine room here. According to the systematic reviews we analyzed, wearable bands, so your typical smartwatches and fitness straps, they are by far the dominant form factor. They represent about 64% of all the devices utilized in these clinical studies. And they pull their data primarily from two distinct sensors. The first one is the accelerometer.
Right, the movement tracker, the thing that measures acceleration forces to figure out, like, your speed, your spatial orientation.
Direction, yeah.
Yeah, it's how the watch knows if you're jogging or, typing furiously at your desk or tossing and turning in your sleep. But the second sensor is the one that really crosses the line from, like, fitness tracking into actual medical territory.
Exactly. The PPG sensor, photoplethysmography.
Which is, an absolute mouthful.
Right.
But practically speaking, for anyone who has ever flipped their watch over, it's just that little cluster of flashing green LEDs on the back.
Right. That's the one. And the mechanics of how those LEDs work are actually fascinating. The sensor actively shines light through your epidermis and right down into the microvascular tissue of your wrist.
Okay.
So every single time your heart beats, it pushes a wave of blood through those tiny capillaries. That sudden increase in blood volume changes the physical properties of your tissue for just, a fraction of a second, which then slightly alters the amount of green light that bounces back to the sensor.
Wow.
Yeah, and by capturing those microscopic optical fluctuations, the device calculates your heart rate.
But, think about the physical reality of that for a second. That sounds incredibly fragile. Like your arm is swinging, you're sweating, the watch is sliding up and down your wrist, the ambient lighting in the room is changing. The raw sensor data coming back from that little green light must be absolute chaos.
Oh, it is.
So how does the device pull a clean medical metric out of all that noise?
Well, it doesn't. Not on its own, anyway. The hardware alone is completely insufficient. That gap between a messy, sliding piece of glass and an accurate heart rate reading is bridged entirely by complex artificial intelligence.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, the research points out that companies like Fitbit, they rely on advanced neural network architectures, while Apple utilizes deep learning models to process these massive data pipelines.
So it's like the watch acts as a bilingual translator. The human body speaks this messy analog language of sweat and movement, and the AI translates it into neat digital graphs on your phone.
That's a great way to put it.
Let's talk about how the AI actually achieves that, though, because the sources do mention a few specific algorithms. First, convolutional neural networks, or CNNs. Now, usually, we hear about CNNs in the context of facial recognition, right? Like an AI scanning a crowd to find a specific person. How on earth does that apply to a pulse?
Right, so in this context, CNNs are deployed to process time series data. Instead of looking at a static image of a face, the algorithm is looking at a continuous flowing stream of messy sensor readings over a long period of time.
Gotcha.
And the CNN is incredibly efficient at filtering out the noise of, say, a bumpy bus ride and extracting the hidden, relevant physiological features underneath.
Okay, that makes sense. The research also highlights random forests, which I kind of like to visualize as a massive high-speed flow chart. It's looking at the data and asking thousands of yes or no questions in milliseconds just to recognize a pattern.
Exactly. It learns what a normal rhythmic walking pattern looks like, so it can instantly flag a sudden, chaotic, falling pattern.
Right. And then there are support vector machines, or SVMs, which they play a crucial role in categorizing the data once the patterns are actually identified.
Yep.
Let me see if I can translate how an SVM works here. Imagine plotting every single heartbeat from a patient on a giant piece of paper. The healthy, normal beats form a tight cluster on the left side of the paper, and the dangerous, irregular beats form a cluster on the right.
Okay, tracking with you.
An SVM acts kind of like a mathematical lasso. It draws this highly precise, complex boundary line right between those two clusters. That way, the second a new heartbeat registers and lands on the wrong side of that line, your watch vibrates and tells you something is wrong.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it.
Yeah.
The SVM draws the mathematical threshold for health versus anomaly. But, and here's the big, but as researchers, we know that an AI drawing a mathematical lasso is still just making a highly educated guess.
Exactly. If it relies so heavily on AI algorithms to essentially filter out reality and guess what the body is doing based on historical patterns, doesn't that leave a lot of room for error? Like, does it actually work in a real clinical setting?
Well, that brings us to the clinical evidence. We have to evaluate where the data proves these algorithms are actually catching the right signals. Let's look at that Apple Watch pilot study, because the setup for this was wild.
It really was.
Researchers took a small group of patients who were undergoing plastic and reconstructive surgery. These patients were placed under general anesthesia, and the researchers basically just strapped a Series 3 Apple Watch to their wrists and then recorded data points every few seconds for about 25 minutes per patient.
And the crucial part here is they compared the watch data directly to a hospital-grade ECG machine. That is the gold standard. The ECG provides a continuous, perfectly calibrated baseline of the heart's electrical activity. They ended up with 1,214 matched pairs of data, comparing the watch's reading to the hospital ECG's reading at the exact same millisecond.
And the results were remarkably tight. Out of those 1,214 pairs, the average difference between the consumer Apple Watch and the hospital machinery was only 0.60 beats per minute.
Less than 1 beat per minute difference. That's incredible.
Right. Now, in research terms, that tiny difference is statistically significant, meaning we know it wasn't just a random fluke of the math, but it is absolutely not clinically significant.
Oh, because it wouldn't change anything.
Exactly. If a patient's heart rate is 72 beats per minute versus 72.6 beats per minute, that difference will never alter a doctor's diagnostic decision or treatment plan.
Right. The study actually noted that the two devices were moving in near-perfect lockstep. They evaluated the watch's readings against the acceptable error bound set by the American National Standards Institute. Out of all those readings, only 3 fell outside the safety bounds. Just 3.
What's fascinating here is how this isolated pilot study perfectly mirrors the findings of the massive 38-article systematic cardiovascular review we examined.
Really?
Yeah. When you zoom out and look at the aggregate data across thousands of patients, it confirms that basic heart rate and heart rate variability are the strongest clinical features of these devices.
So measuring a basic pulse is essentially a solved problem for wearables at this point.
Pretty much. And they offer a massive advantage over traditional methods. I mean, a standard ECG gives a physician a 10-second snapshot of your heart while you're lying perfectly still on an exam table. A smartwatch gives the physician a longitudinal view, like a movie of your heart, over weeks and months.
That's a huge difference.
It is. It makes them uniquely powerful tools for continuous monitoring and early population-level screening, especially for cardiac arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation. AFib is notoriously intermittent. It might act up on a Tuesday and be completely silent by the time you actually see your doctor on Thursday.
So on the surface, it sounds like a complete slam dunk. I mean, if the technology is this accurate, why even bother scheduling an appointment with a cardiologist? Why not just let the watch diagnose us?
Because context is everything in medical research. The strength of the evidence changes dramatically depending on what metric you are measuring, and more importantly, how the study validating that metric was actually designed.
Here's where it gets really interesting, actually, because relying entirely on a smartwatch right now is a lot like trusting the check engine light on your car's dashboard.
Oh, definitely.
It is a fantastic early warning system. It tells you that something under the hood might be outside of normal parameters, but you still have to take the car to a mechanic who has the specialized, deep diagnostic tools to figure out exactly which valve is broken and, how to fix it.
That is the perfect framework for this. And if we apply that critical framework back to the Apple Watch anesthesia study, the one with the near-perfect accuracy, we quickly expose some pretty glaring methodological limitations. First, consider the sample size.
Oh, right, there were only 5 patients in that study.
5. An N of 5 is a microscopic pilot study. It serves as an interesting proof of concept, sure, but it is entirely insufficient to change medical guidelines. But the second limitation is even more critical. The study explicitly notes that all 5 of those surgical patients were in normal sinus rhythm.
Meaning they all had perfectly healthy, regular heartbeats to begin with.
Right.
So methodologically, we cannot take an algorithm that successfully tracked 5 healthy hearts and just blindly assume it will maintain that 99% accuracy when strapped to a patient whose heart is beating erratically during a severe cardiac event.
Furthermore, let's think about the environment of that study.
Wait, they were under general anesthesia, meaning they were unconscious and completely paralyzed. They weren't moving at all.
Exactly.
No wonder the motion artifacts and the messy data weren't an issue. The watch didn't have to filter out swinging arms or bouncing steps.
Precisely. It was an artificially perfect environment for a PPG sensor. And when you pull back and look at the systematic reviews, you see these types of methodological flaws operating on a much larger scale. The overarching literature is severely compromised by a lack of large-scale randomized controlled trials.
Randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, which are like the absolute gold standard in medical research because they are designed to isolate variables and prove cause and effect.
Yes. But the reviews show that the vast majority of wearable studies are purely observational. They are short-term, small-scale, and primarily focused on technical validation.
So they prove the device can accurately record a pulse, but they fundamentally struggle to prove that wearing the device actually reduces a patient's long-term risk of suffering a heart attack or a stroke.
Exactly. And the technical limitations become glaringly obvious the second you step outside of an operating room. The data shows that those light-based PPG sensors frequently fail during high-intensity physical activity.
Wow, really?
Yeah, if you are swinging your arms on a run, the sensor literally loses sight of the microvascular signal. The watch essentially goes blind.
That's crazy. And while the AI is great at estimating a basic pulse, the reviews emphasize that the evidence plummets when we look at complex clinical parameters. Take non-invasive blood pressure monitoring, for example.
Right.
Wearables attempting to track blood pressure show massive variability compared to a standard inflatable arm cuff. The smartwatch readings are highly susceptible to changes in your body position or even slight calibration errors.
The same applies to monitoring complex conditions like heart failure. The data suggests that giving a patient a wearable might help them adhere to a daily routine, but there is no consistent evidence that it actually reduces hospital readmission rates. We really have to actively warn against technological overclaim here.
The ultimate takeaway from a research perspective is that these devices are strictly an adjunct, like an intermediate level adjunct. They are a brilliant supplement to evidence-based clinical practice, but they are absolutely not a substitute for conventional medical examinations.
Right. They belong in a supportive role.
Right.
But, there's an entirely different layer to this conversation. We've evaluated the hardware limitations and the clinical trial methodologies. Now we have to evaluate the invisible architecture powering the entire system.
The dark side of the data. Because if these devices rely so heavily on artificial intelligence to filter out motion artifacts and draw those mathematical boundaries between health and sickness, we have to look at how that AI was built in the first place. We mentioned earlier that these algorithms don't just inherently know what a human heartbeat looks like, they have to be trained.
They do. They learn by analyzing massive validation data sets like MobiAct or Deep Dance. These are basically warehouses of data containing thousands of hours of human movement, walking patterns, and recorded heart rates.
And here is the fundamental problem with machine learning. An AI model is only as intelligent and as unbiased as the data it's fed. If a heart rate monitor's algorithm is trained primarily on a homogeneous data set, let's say mostly young, able-bodied individuals with lighter skin tones, it is going to internalize those specific physiological parameters as the baseline for normal.
Which leads to highly skewed and potentially dangerous inaccuracies when that exact same algorithm is deployed on a diverse global population.
Think about the physical mechanics of the PPG sensor again. It relies entirely on shining light into the skin and measuring the reflection. Melanin absorbs light. If the AI's validation data set lacks diversity in skin melanin levels, the algorithm might literally struggle to accurately read the heart rate of someone from a different ethnic background. The math itself becomes fundamentally biased because it doesn't understand the physics of the user's skin.
Right. And if the training data is biased, the resulting medical insights will inherently be biased. But beyond the issue of algorithmic fairness, we also have to confront the staggering privacy implications. Because wearable technology generates the most intimate, continuous stream of personal data imaginable.
The sources specifically contrast how different tech giants handle this data. Apple, through its HealthKit infrastructure, leans heavily into strict user privacy, emphasizing that data is encrypted and stored locally on the device. But then the text points out that Fitbit's privacy policy contains clauses indicating that user data can actually be utilized for targeted advertising.
And the common defense from tech companies is, well, anonymization. They promise to strip your name, your email, and your phone number from the health data before they use it or share it. But the research warns that in the age of advanced artificial intelligence, anonymization is largely a myth.
This is where it gets genuinely chilling. The algorithms have become so sophisticated that they can reverse engineer your identity from an anonymous spreadsheet.
It's true.
Think about that. You take away the GPS location and the user profile, you hand a tech company a blank data set containing nothing but heart rate fluctuations and accelerometer data showing how a person swings their arms when they walk. And the AI can analyze those tiny physiological quirks and say, I know exactly who this is because nobody else's heart rate spikes quite like this specific pattern when they climb a flight of stairs.
Yeah, by analyzing unique physiological signatures, the AI can absolutely re-identify the individual. Anonymity is essentially dead if your biology acts as your barcode.
And all of this is compounded by the black box problem.
Right, because deep neural networks are notoriously opaque. The architecture is a literal black box. The messy sensor data goes in, the AI performs millions of calculations, and a health prediction comes out. But the mathematical pathway the algorithm took to arrive at that prediction is so convoluted that it's completely invisible to human observation.
So if a black box model flags a serious health anomaly based on your wearable data, neither you nor your physician can actually see the logic of how it made that decision.
Exactly.
So what does this all actually mean for you, the person wearing the device? Let's say your smartwatch assures you that your heart is perfectly healthy. But what if the algorithm making that judgment has a built-in bias against your specific demographic? Or it's making a black box decision based on flawed assumptions about your resting heart rate? You might be lulled into a completely false sense of security, ignoring actual physical symptoms because the tiny doctor on your wrist says you're fine.
Which perfectly illustrates why the medical research community views these devices through a lens of incredible excitement, but tempered by extreme caution.
Okay, let's try to synthesize all of this. What is our final verdict as medical researchers evaluating the state of wearable tech? We found that wristbands utilizing accelerometers and PPG sensors are genuinely brilliant tools for the continuous longitudinal tracking of basic vitals.
Absolutely. They are unmatched for early population-level screening. They excel at catching intermittent issues like atrial fibrillation that a standard clinic visit would completely miss. And when they are tested under highly controlled conditions, their baseline tracking is incredibly precise.
But our critical evaluation also exposes a structurally weak foundation. Until the medical field conducts massive, highly diverse, randomized controlled trials that focus on long-term clinical outcomes rather than just technical accuracy, these devices cannot be treated as diagnostic gospel. They are a supportive tool. They're the check engine light, not the mechanic.
And we cannot ignore the unresolved ethical and structural challenges. Algorithmic bias, the opacity of black box medical decisions, and, the terrifying reality of data privacy in a world where your anonymous heartbeat can just be reverse engineered to reveal your identity.
Which leaves us with a final, slightly provocative thought to chew on. We know these AI algorithms are evolving at an exponential rate. It is entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that in the near future, your smartwatch might recognize a complex physiological pattern and accurately predict a major health event, like a heart attack or stroke days, or even weeks before you feel a single physical symptom. It's a miraculous medical possibility. But in a landscape where companies leverage data for advertising and where AI can casually strip away your anonymity, what happens if your health insurance provider or your employer purchases access to that prediction before you even get the notification? Who truly owns the future of your health data and the algorithmic predictions made about your own body? Just something to think about tomorrow morning when you strap that device back onto your wrist.